George Carlin, a great friend of mine who helped me tremendously. Arguably the most admired and a comic because for several reasons. One, he had 26 albums. I've made one album. Doing a really good comedy album is like writing a novel. And I would dare say that close to 20 of those albums are classics. No one was as prolific as George. No one was as generous. You ask Lewis Black, Gary Shandling, Dennis Leary, many comics either hung out backstage, you know, to talk to him or wrote him a letter, and he always was incredibly supportive.
George Carlin was always dead funny, but somewhere right around the time I started paying attention to him, just shortly after the early Ed Sullivan appearances and things where I would see him, and he was hilarious, the hippy-dippy weatherman and everything, he just went into this whole, he must have had some kind of epiphany, because he just started telling the truth with a capital T. And people were shocked.
And one of the coolest things about George Carlin was that he didn't have a filter. He really showed the world that comedians were the greatest advocates of free speech and the First Amendment. He didn't care who he pissed off. He thrived on shocking people, his audience. I got to see him perform a few times, and you were always like, oh my God, I can't believe he just said that. And when you see somebody get away with that, not just get away with it, but be honored and make a name for himself and be successful, just speaking his mind, and it really inspires other comedians to really try to emulate that.
I think he was just a master in his use of language, and he was more, I mean, his pieces were so well devised and structured. Carlin didn't want to just make you laugh, he wanted to make you think. And I think his whole feeling was that if he could make you laugh about something, he had a way to get into your brain to try to convince you how insane the world was, and that he was absolutely right.
I don't think there's a comedian before or since who has understood and manipulated the language in the way that George Carlin did. Stand-up comedy became a kind of literary form with him. And you know, he was a great physical comedian too, in terms of sort of the way he was able to convey his jokes facially, using his body and the rest of it. But I think one of the reasons George Carlin's records hold up so well is because when you lose all the physicality, you're left with the raw language, and the language itself is just beautifully constructed.
He had the biggest set of balls in show business history. He was amazing.
All the comedians owe a huge debt to George Carlin.
Carlin was more of a philosopher. Carlin was more of a sage.
It's just a huge loss. He was an incredible comedic force, a genius about language, psychology, sociology, sex, and he had a heart as big as the world. I mean, he was an incredible guy.